I never thought a neighborhood could feel like a battlefield, until the day I realized my little cabin by the lake had become the center of a full-blown HOA drama. And not just any HOA drama, the kind where they call the cops because you refuse to pay dues for something you technically don't even belong to. It started innocently enough. I had bought this property years ago, a quiet little slice of heaven where the lake shimmered at sunrise and the woods whispered secrets at night. The kind of place where neighbors wave from a distance and the loudest noise is a loon calling across the water. I loved it, I really did. But apparently some people in the neighborhood didn't care about peace, they cared about power. Enter Karen, you know the type. Perfect hair, perfectly pressed clothes, perfectly self-righteous. She was the HOA president, and from the moment I met her I could tell she thought the world revolved around her little rulebook. She'd cruise the neighborhood like a queen, inspecting her subjects, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp for anything that didn't fit her perfect mold. And from the very first letter I received from her, I knew trouble was coming. It was a short note typed in all caps with threats and fines that sounded ridiculous. Your property violates HOA guidelines. Immediate compliance required. I blinked at the envelope. I wasn't in their HOA, never had been. Legally, I didn't have to follow a single one of their rules, but reading that letter, I felt my blood boil. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe she's just doing her job. I didn't want drama. I had a lake to fish, trees to admire, and a cabin that smelled faintly of pine and old wood. But the next morning, I noticed her car parked across from my driveway. I watched from the window as she strutted up, clipboard raised like she was about to declare war on me personally. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked at me like I had personally offended the HOA gods. "Good morning," I said cautiously, trying to keep my calm. "Your mailbox color," she said immediately, pointing. "It's not allowed, you must repaint it." I blinked. "I'm not in your HOA." Her eyes widened as if I had just screamed in a library. "Excuse me." I said, "I'm not in your HOA," I repeated, smiling to myself. She looked like she had bitten into something sour, trying to process that someone could dare defy her authority. "You can't just," she sputtered. I held up a hand. "I can, and I am." She didn't know what to do. Her perfectly calculated composure cracked, and I could see her frustration radiating off her like steam from a boiling pot. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would end here, but no, it never ends there with someone like Karen. Later that afternoon, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, I noticed her knocking on neighbors' doors, whispering, pointing at me, plotting. I felt like I had unwittingly stepped into a sitcom, but one that might get ugly very fast. Then came the knock at my door I wasn't expecting. Not her, the police. 2 officers, serious faces, radios crackling, looking like they were ready for a bank robbery, not a homeowner politely refusing to join a club. "Sir, we received a complaint about violations on your property," one of them said. I almost laughed out loud. Violations, my cabin, my land, my rules. I tried to explain. "I'm not in the HOA, I own this property, there's no violation." They nodded politely, clearly not sure if I was insane or if Karen had somehow twisted the truth into a felony. I smiled, trying to hide my satisfaction at the absurdity of it all. Little did I know this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't just going to settle for being ignored. She had bigger plans, and if I thought the police visit was the climax, I was about to find out just how far this HOA could go. Because that evening, as I checked my mailbox again, there it was. A new letter thicker than the last, dripping with threats and fines. And somewhere deep inside I felt that spark, the one that whispers, this isn't just a fight over mailboxes, this is war. And little did Karen know, she was about to step on land she didn't even realize I owned. The next morning I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel again. My heart sank before I even looked outside. There she was, Karen. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the sun like she was about to star in a reality show called Neighborhood Dictators. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just marched straight up the path like she owned the air around me. I opened the door, bracing myself. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual, though my stomach had tied itself in knots. "Good morning," she said, voice sharp like a whip. "We need to discuss your property. It's come to our attention that—" "Hold on," I interrupted, smiling just enough to be polite. "I'm not in your HOA." Her face froze, the kind of frozen where you know someone's about to try to argue with facts they've never read. "Excuse me." I said, "I'm not in your HOA," I repeated, a little firmer this time. For a moment I thought she might collapse. Her perfectly lined lips trembled, and she clutched her clipboard like it was a lifeboat in the middle of a stormy ocean. "You can't just," she sputtered, words trailing off into a nervous squeak. I leaned on the doorframe. "I can, and I am. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a lake to enjoy and a mailbox that I happen to like blue." Her eyes narrowed and I could practically see smoke curling off her ears. She glared at me like I had personally offended every HOA member who had ever lived. But before she could find a comeback, my neighbor peeked through the fence. She gave me a little thumbs up, trying to suppress a laugh. That tiny gesture reminded me I wasn't entirely alone in this battle. Karen, though, was far from done. She squared her shoulders and dropped the clipboard onto my porch floor with a thud. "I'm calling this in. You're breaking our rules and it's not over." I blinked. "Breaking rules that don't apply to me?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She didn't answer, just stormed off, muttering something about enforcing community standards. I watched her stomp across the lawn like a general retreating from a war she thought she had already won. I shook my head and laughed quietly to myself. This was absurd. A grown woman treating a lake cabin like it belonged in a police procedural drama. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Karen never gave up. By mid-afternoon, things escalated faster than I expected. I was sitting on the dock, feet dangling in the water, when I saw a black SUV pull into my driveway. My stomach dropped. Not again. 2 officers stepped out, serious faces, scanning the cabin like it had just been robbed. One of them knocked politely, while the other just stared at the lake as if expecting pirates to emerge from the reeds. "Sir," the first officer said, "we received a complaint about violations on your property." I swallowed hard, trying to hide my irritation and my amusement at the same time. "I'm not part of any HOA," I explained. "I own this property outright. There are no violations." The officer looked at me, then glanced at his partner. I could see the confusion. "How do you explain to someone that the person who reported you might be the crazy one?" Meanwhile, Karen's voice cut through the tension as she arrived in a flurry, pointing at the house. "They're in violation. They have." She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the officers staring at her blankly. I tried not to laugh out loud. The sheer irony of it all was too much. Here she was, calling in law enforcement to enforce rules on a property she didn't even know wasn't hers. The officers were polite but firm. "Ma'am, sir says he owns the land and isn't part of your HOA." Her face turned red. "He can't just..." "He can," I said calmly. "I do." Her lips quivered. She was struggling to find words, fumbling like a high schooler caught cheating on a test. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just a small argument, it was a full-blown power struggle, and for once she had no leverage. As the officers left, giving me a nod of understanding, I felt a thrill run through me. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen wasn't someone who accepted defeat gracefully. That evening I returned to the cabin, only to find a stack of letters waiting for me. Fines, threats, warnings, all of them dripping with that same self-righteous venom. I stared at them, realizing this was bigger than a mailbox dispute. She was relentless. And then, like a spark in the dark, an idea hit me. A thought so wild it made my heart race. What if there was a way I could turn the tables completely? What if this battle wasn't just about ignoring her, but showing her that she had absolutely no idea who she was messing with? I picked up the letters and smiled, just the tiniest knowing smile. "Karen," I whispered to myself, "you're about to find out the rules of this game, and they're mine." The lake reflected the last light of day, calm and serene, but inside I felt a storm brewing, a storm that I was ready to unleash. I thought the police visit the day before had been the climax of Karen's little vendetta. I was wrong, dead wrong. The next morning I stepped outside, still half asleep, coffee in hand, expecting the peaceful sound of water lapping against the dock. Instead I heard it, a low hum of engines. My heart sank. A black SUV was idling in my driveway again. Not one but 2 patrol cars flanked it this time. I blinked. Did she really call them again? For what exactly? My mailbox color. I took a deep breath, telling myself to stay calm. I wasn't a criminal. I owned this land. I had rights. But right now, all I felt was the absurdity pressing down on me, heavy as the summer humidity. The first officer knocked, and I opened the door, squinting at the morning sun. "Sir," he said politely, "we received another complaint." Are you aware of any violations on your property? I let out a dry laugh, though I tried to keep it inside. Another complaint, I asked. About what this time? My grass is too green. The officer glanced at his partner, trying not to smirk. They mentioned multiple things: landscaping, mailbox color, and he paused, some sort of unauthorized water use. I blinked. Unauthorized water use, I echoed. This is my lake, my property. There's no authorization needed. I didn't know anyone else owned it. That's when Karen appeared, storming across the yard like she had rehearsed this moment 100 times in front of the mirror. Clipboard in hand, red as a fire truck, pointing wildly. They're breaking all the rules. This is an outrage. You have to. The officers held up a hand. Ma'am, he's explaining the situation. Situation, she barked. He's destroying the neighborhood, he. Her words fell apart mid-sentence, replaced by furious gasps. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her unravel. The sheer irony made my lips twitch. She had called law enforcement, expecting me to crumble, only to find the officers nodding politely as I calmly laid out my side. I could almost hear the mental cogs grinding in her head. I thought I had power, and yet I have none. One officer finally spoke. Ma'am, sir says he owns the property and is not part of your HOA. Her face froze, then turned crimson. She opened her mouth, closed it, muttered something under her breath. I couldn't help myself. I chuckled softly. Yes, Karen, I said, trying not to sound smug. Exactly that. She tried to argue again, pointing at the lake, the dock, even my mailbox, as if gestures could somehow rewrite property law. But the officers remained calm. Ma'am, we're just here to make sure there's no conflict. Legally, there isn't anything to enforce here. And just like that, she flinched. The once imposing HOA queen suddenly looked small, trapped, powerless. I almost felt bad, almost. But the story doesn't end there, because as Karen retreated, muttering threats about legal action, I realized something important. The officers had left, the morning sun glittered across the water, and I was alone with the realization that she had overplayed her hand. I started thinking, if she thinks she can bully me without knowing the full picture, what else is she unaware of? I grabbed the deed to my property, sitting in the cabin where it had rested quietly for years, almost forgotten. I skimmed through it, heart racing, curiosity bubbling. And then I saw it. The lines on the legal map, the words in the fine print, they made my stomach drop and my pulse race. Karen and her HOA weren't just annoying, they were trespassing. They had built their so-called common areas on my land. Every meeting, every sign, every path they claimed as theirs was legally mine. I was silent for a long moment, staring at the page, feeling a mix of disbelief, amusement, and a rush of excitement. I ran my finger along the boundary lines, laughing quietly to myself. Karen had been marching around my property, barking orders, threatening fines, and she didn't even realize the land beneath her feet belonged to me. That night I sat on my porch looking at the lake, heart pounding. I knew what this meant. This wasn't just a fight over letters or mailbox colors anymore. This was a war I could win completely, and the irony was so delicious I almost couldn't contain myself. I didn't know yet exactly how I was going to do it, but one thing was clear. Karen had no idea what she was stepping into, and soon she would. And just like that, the calm of my little lakefront paradise shattered. The storm was coming, and I was ready to turn the tables in ways she couldn't even imagine. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept turning the deed over in my hands like it was a secret map to buried treasure. My cabin, my lake, and most importantly, the land the HOA had been strutting around on for months, all mine, every inch. I'd always thought of it as mine in a general sense, but seeing the legal lines, seeing the fine print, it hit me. This wasn't just property, this was power. The next morning I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the neighborhood from my porch. Karen's minions, the board members, were busy planting flowers, moving signs, trimming bushes. They all thought they were enforcing rules. Little did they know, every step they took on that perfectly manicured grass was technically trespassing. My blood warmed with a mix of fury and glee. I decided to take a closer look at the HOA's common areas, the places where Karen had hosted meetings, installed private property signs, and even laid down paths. As I walked through, it felt surreal. I had been polite for months, letting their threats slide, and now here I was, finally seeing the full scope of their audacity. The board had no clue, not one hint of awareness. They were so busy feeling important, stamping their feet on my property, that they hadn't bothered to check ownership records. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about ignoring fines anymore. This was about showing them in no uncertain terms who really held the cards. I started making plans. First, I'd gather every document, every map, every proof of ownership I could find. Then I'd figure out the perfect way to confront them, not angrily, not yet, but strategically. I wanted them to feel the absurdity of their own arrogance. I wanted Karen to sweat just a little as she realized she had been strutting across land she didn't even own. And I had ideas, some small, some bold. I pictured myself at the next HOA meeting, calmly dropping the documents on the table, watching her face twist from smugness to panic. I imagined the murmurs spreading among the other board members as they realized that the self-righteous queen of the neighborhood had no power at all. But as exciting as it was, I knew I had to tread carefully. Karen wasn't just arrogant, she was vindictive. She had already called the cops on me twice. Who knew what she would try next? I needed evidence and I needed strategy. That afternoon, I went back to the cabin office and spread out the deeds, maps, and legal papers. I marked every path, every piece of land the HOA had been using, every inch of their common area. And as I did, a grin crept across my face. The irony was too perfect. Every meeting they had held, every rule they had enforced, every threat they had made, it was all on my land, all of it. I thought about Karen's reaction when she realized that all her power was built on a foundation that didn't exist. She'd been confident, smug, untouchable, and now I had the upper hand. The thought was delicious, almost intoxicating. But the most important thing I realized that night was this: I could either escalate slowly, letting them stew in their ignorance, or I could strike decisively. And while patience had its virtues, revenge, well-planned, clever, and legal, had its own rewards. I felt a thrill of excitement at the thought of showing them, once and for all, that rules only mattered if you actually had authority. I poured a cup of coffee and stared out at the lake, moonlight dancing on the water. Calm and serene, yet beneath it I felt the storm building. Karen had no idea what was coming, and that was the best part. She thought she controlled the neighborhood, but in reality she was just a pawn strutting across my stage. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about my first move. It had to be subtle, yet undeniable. Something that would make her question her life choices, make the board members whisper in disbelief, and make the neighbors gasp when they realized who had been quietly in control all along. And as I sipped my coffee, I made a silent promise. Karen would never look at my property or me the same way again, not when I was done. The only question was, how far could I push her before she realized she had been playing on the wrong side of the law all along? And that, I realized with a slow, deliberate smile, was part of the fun. The next week, I realized Karen had no intention of backing down. If anything, she was escalating. It was almost impressive how determined she could be when she had no clue she was on the losing side. It started with the HOA newsletter. I normally ignored it, but this one landed on my porch with a little extra flair, as if someone had personally thrown it in my face. Every line dripped with self-righteous authority, reminders about community standards, fines for unauthorized use of property, and a particularly passive-aggressive section about lawn care. I leaned back on my porch, coffee in hand, trying not to laugh. She had no idea that the little strip of grass she was judging like it belonged to her had been mine for years. The absurdity of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. I could almost hear her typing it, fingers clacking furiously, imagining that she was some kind of neighborhood monarch. Then came the knock, not a polite one this time. It was stomping, shuffling, the sound of someone who thought confrontation meant intimidation. I opened the door and there she was, clipboard in hand, a look of determination carved across her face. "I'm hosting a community meeting on the lakeside property tomorrow," she said, pointing at the dock with all the authority of a drill sergeant. "You're expected to attend, and we will be discussing your violations." I blinked slowly. She wanted me to attend a meeting on my own land discussing rules that didn't apply to me. My brain short-circuited trying to process the audacity. "I see," I said carefully, trying not to laugh too loud. "And what exactly will happen if I don't attend?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Fines, legal action, enforcement, everything necessary to maintain community standards." I nodded thoughtfully. "Everything necessary, got it, thanks for the invitation." She scowled, muttered something under her breath, and stormed off. I could feel the neighbors' eyes on me, some peeking from behind curtains, some whispering excitedly. I grinned. Oh, they were watching. They were about to see Karen stumble in ways no one could have predicted. The next day I walked down to the dock early, surveying the area where she planned to host her meeting. Tables, chairs, banners, all of it on my land. Every inch of that carefully orchestrated HOA spectacle was technically trespassing. My pulse quickened. The possibilities were endless. I could raise objections calmly and legally, or I could have a little fun first. When Karen arrived with the board, clipboard in hand, she looked around with smug satisfaction, completely unaware that her kingdom was built on land that wasn't hers. I greeted her politely, a warm smile plastered across my face. "Morning, Karen," I said. "I hope you brought a permit." Her jaw dropped. "Permit for what?" "For using my property," I replied evenly, letting my words hang in the air like a hammer ready to drop. "This dock, this lawn, the area where you're meeting is technically all mine." Her face went through every shade of red and purple I didn't even know humans could display. She blinked, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The board members looked confused, glancing at each other, whispering nervously. You car," Karen sputtered, voice trembling. You. I held up my deed, waving it lazily. "Oh, I can and I do." The silence was delicious. Even the lake seemed to pause, reflecting the tension in the air. Every word I spoke was like a drop of cold water on her ego. She had spent months trying to assert control, and now she had none, not a single ounce. I leaned closer and smiled. "You've been hosting meetings, posting signs, and enforcing rules on my land for months. I'd like to discuss compensation." Her shoulders slumped. I could see the panic rising in her eyes, the realization that she had been strutting on someone else's stage this entire time. The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them whispered, "I didn't know." I nodded, savoring the moment. "Exactly, none of you did, and now we have a little decision to make." Karen opened her mouth again, but this time no words came out. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes you hold your breath and lean forward, waiting for the first move. I knew then that the game had changed. Karen had pushed too far, stepped on ground she didn't own, and underestimated me completely. From here on, every move she made would be carefully watched, and every misstep could be used. I leaned back, folding my arms, and let the silence do the talking. For the first time, Karen realized the tables had turned. And that, I knew with a quiet thrill, was only the beginning. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning. I knew it would be the moment Karen realized she had seriously underestimated me, but I also knew I had to be calm, confident, calculated. One wrong move and she might find some loophole, some technicality to cling to. But I had something she didn't even know existed: the law, the deed, and the moral high ground. I arrived early, pretending to casually stroll along the path to the dock. In reality, my pulse was hammering like a drum, anticipation coursing through every vein. The board members were already there, adjusting chairs and arranging papers, unaware that they were on my land. Karen arrived last, looking regal as always, but there was a tension in her step, a tightness around her eyes. I could see it. She knew something was off. "Good morning," I said brightly, standing by the dock, my deed and maps in hand. "Lovely day for a meeting, isn't it?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, well, I see you're here." Her voice carried a forced firmness, the kind you use when trying to hide fear. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied. "But before we begin, I thought it might be helpful to go over a few legal details." She frowned, suspicion flashing across her face. "Legal details." I spread the deed across the table, letting my fingers linger on the edges like I was presenting an art piece. "This property, mine every inch. The lake, the dock, the lawns where you've hosted meetings, put up signs and enforced rules. Technically, all of it is under my ownership." Karen froze, her clipboard slipping from her grasp. One of the board members gasped, whispering, "Wait, that can't be." "Oh, it can," I said, watching their expressions change from smug indifference to nervous confusion. "In fact, everything you've been doing here, meetings, fines, posts, has been happening on land that belongs to me. And technically," I paused, enjoying the suspense, "that makes all your enforcement without my consent a trespass." Karen's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might actually faint. The board members shuffled uneasily, muttering apologies, glancing at one another like children caught stealing candy. You can't," Karen began, but her voice cracked. She looked around desperately, as if trying to summon some invisible authority that would save her. There was none. I smiled faintly. "Oh, I can and I do, but I'm a reasonable person. So here's what we'll do. Any meetings, signs, or fines conducted on this property, they require my permission first. And any further trespassing," I let the words hang in the air like a promise, "will be documented and addressed accordingly." The room was silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat. The tension was electric. Karen's shoulders slumped, her perfectly polished composure crumbled in seconds. She was used to controlling everything, everyone, but here she had no power at all. A neighbor peeked through the trees, whispering, "Is he serious?" Another nodded wide-eyed, as if seeing the neighborhood's secret battle play out live. I leaned forward, my tone calm but sharp. "Karen, I hope this clarifies things. I'm more than willing to let the community enjoy the space, but only if it's legal, fair, and on my terms." Her face twisted with fury and disbelief. "You can't just—" "Yes, I can," I interrupted. "And legally I already have. The law isn't on your side, Karen, not even a little." There was a pause so long it felt like hours. Then, as if realizing the weight of what had just happened, Karen finally muttered, "We'll review this." I nodded, keeping my calm, letting her squirm in front of the board and neighbors alike. "Please do, take all the time you need. I'll be here watching." As I stepped back, letting the dock and lake absorb the silence, I could see the shift in energy. Karen's aura of authority was gone. She was no longer the queen of the neighborhood. She was a visitor in my world on land she didn't even own. And the neighbors, their whispers of admiration and disbelief were practically audible. I smiled quietly to myself, savoring the moment, but deep down I knew this was only the beginning. Karen was not the type to walk away quietly. She would push, scheme, maybe even escalate, but this time I had all the cards. As I looked out over the water, I realized something exhilarating. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one on the defensive. I was the one in control, and when Karen finally realized it fully, the fallout would be spectacular. The sun glittered across the lake, calm and peaceful, but inside I felt a storm building. The next moves would define the battle. Karen had no idea what was coming, and that, I thought with a sly grin, was the best part of all. Karen didn't take my warning quietly. Of course she didn't. By Monday morning I could already see the desperation in her eyes from across the street. She had started packing in front of the property, clipboard clutched like it was a lifeline. Every HOA rule she had enforced, every fine she had threatened, it was coming back to haunt her. And I had front row seats to the show. I decided it was time to remind her, in a way she would never forget, who really held the power. First, I quietly put up a small sign at the edge of the dock. "Private property, HOA requires permission to access." Nothing flashy, just enough to poke at her. By the time she arrived, frantically clutching her own stack of letters and threats, she saw it and froze. Her eyes darted from the sign to me and back again. I smiled innocently. "Morning, Karen," I said casually, as if nothing had happened. "You can't," she stammered, voice rising, hand shaking slightly. "Oh, I can," I said calmly. "It's right there on paper, and legally enforceable." Her face went red, a mix of fury, embarrassment, and panic. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, trying to find a way out of the mess she had created, but there was none. I let her stew for a moment, enjoying the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the dock. Then I laid out the first piece of my little revenge plan. I handed the deed and maps to her and the board, letting them absorb the reality of the situation. "The property you've been using," I said, voice calm but sharp, "belongs to me. Any meetings, signs, or rules you enforce on this land now require my consent." Karen's jaw dropped, and the board members whispered to each other, eyes wide. "This can't be legal," Karen muttered. "Oh, it's very legal," I replied with a small, satisfied smile. "In fact, any further trespassing will be documented and could result in fines or legal action. But being the generous person I am, I'm offering a compromise. You may continue to use the common areas, but only with permission in writing signed by me." Her entire demeanor shifted. She was used to power, and suddenly she had none. She tried to argue, to assert control, but every point she made collapsed under the weight of the truth. I could see her confidence evaporate in real time. And then I raised the stakes. I walked over to the dock, motioning to the surrounding land. Anything you build, post, or maintain on this property from now on, I will be watching closely. Unauthorized use will be billed just like any other service. Landscaping, signs, meetings, you name it." A board member whispered, "I didn't know." Karen glared at them like they had personally betrayed her. I smiled. Watching her scramble was like watching a slow-motion train wreck, mesmerizing and hilarious all at once. But the real payoff came when I hinted at the water rights. Karen had spent months trying to enforce rules about fishing, boating, and lake access, assuming she had authority. I leaned on the dock railing and said casually, "Oh, and by the way, the water flowing through the lake, technically mine too. So any activities you plan there without my consent," I paused, letting the tension hang like a knife in the air, "are at your own risk." Her face went white. The board members glanced at each other, whispering frantically. Karen's composure shattered completely, replaced with panicked muttering. I could have laughed outright, but I held it in, savoring the moment. Every threat she had made over months, every fine, every letter, every smug warning completely meaningless. And now the roles had reversed. She was no longer the ruler, I was. As she stumbled through excuses, I nodded politely, letting the neighbors witness the complete unraveling. They were wide-eyed, some smiling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They had watched her boss people around for months, and now, for the first time, they saw her powerless. I stepped back and let the calm settle in. My revenge wasn't about humiliation, it was about justice, and letting the arrogance of someone like Karen meet the reality of consequences. She would never look at me or anyone on her property the same way again. And as I walked back to my cabin, leaving Karen flustered and the board members whispering like schoolchildren, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of triumph. The storm was over, or at least the first wave had passed. But I knew better than to get too comfortable. Karen would come up with something new, desperate and wild. And when she did, I would be ready. Every inch of this land, every rule she tried to enforce, every tiny act of arrogance, she was about to learn the hard way who really owned the neighborhood. The lake glimmered in the sunset, calm and serene, but I felt the thrill of victory running through me. Karen had underestimated me, she had pushed too far, and the best part, she didn't even see it coming. The next morning I woke up to a quiet lake, the sun just beginning to peek over the trees. Normally it would have been peaceful, serene, but today I felt a different kind of satisfaction. The battle with Karen wasn't over in a single day. It had taken months of absurd letters, police visits and threats, but now finally I had the upper hand, and it was time to seal it. I walked down to the dock with a stack of papers, deeds, maps, and a few extra copies of the HOA rules that conveniently didn't apply to me. I laid them out on the table and took a deep breath. This wasn't about petty revenge anymore. It was about final, undeniable justice. Karen arrived with her usual dramatic flair, clipboard in hand, but something was different. Her posture wasn't confident, it was wary, almost fearful. She scanned the lake, the dock, the land around her, and her eyes finally landed on me, and I could see it, she knew. "I don't understand," she stammered, voice trembling. "Everything I've been enforcing, the fines, the meetings, the signs." "All on my land," I said calmly. "And legally I could take action for each and every one of them, but I'm a reasonable person. I'd rather settle this once and for all." Her eyes darted to the neighbors, many of whom were now peeking from behind their fences, wide-eyed and whispering to each other. I could see the realization hitting her. Everyone had been watching her strut around, thinking she ruled the neighborhood, when in reality, she had been nothing more than a trespasser on my property. I handed her a printed statement. "From now on, any HOA activity on this property requires my written consent. Unauthorized entry or enforcement will be documented and billed accordingly." She flipped through it, hands shaking. "This is, you can't." "I can," I said, voice calm, almost gentle, "and I already have." For the first time, Karen was speechless. The board members shifted uneasily, muttering apologies and excuses, suddenly very aware of the reality of the land beneath their feet. It was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath because you know a storm just passed and the calm is the eye of it. Then I smiled and it felt good, really good. "You see, Karen," I said, leaning back on the railing, "rules only work if they apply, authority only works if it's real, and confidence only works if you know the truth. You didn't know the truth, and now you do." Her face twisted with fury and embarrassment, and I could hear the muttered excuses turning into whispered promises to review everything. I ignored them, letting the reality sink in. For once, Karen had no leverage, not one tiny shred. I glanced at the neighbors who were slowly starting to emerge from their hiding spots. Some gave me small waves, others whispered thanks. They had seen the drama, the ridiculous letters, the police visits, the petty fines, and now, finally, the resolution. I felt a sense of pride, not just in winning, but in setting things right. And then I turned my attention back to Karen. She had one last trick up her sleeve, a final, desperate attempt to regain control. She opened her mouth, likely to lecture, threaten, or manipulate, but I stopped her with a single gesture. "Karen," I said softly but firmly, "this isn't about humiliation. This is about boundaries. You've been reminded of yours. Let's leave it at that." For a moment she hesitated, realizing the fight was over. She nodded slowly, muttering something under her breath before retreating, defeated but still bitter. And as she walked away, I couldn't help but smile. The neighborhood was quiet, the lake shimmered, and the air felt lighter than it had in months. I leaned on the railing and took a deep breath. Months of stress, letters, police visits, and absurd arguments had led to this moment. Karen had learned the hard way that arrogance without knowledge is meaningless, and justice, when wielded calmly and strategically, is unstoppable. I sipped my coffee and looked out over the water. The sun reflected on the surface like a glittering promise. The cabin, the lake, the land, all mine, and for the first time in months I felt completely free. Because in the end, it wasn't just about winning against Karen. It was about reclaiming my peace, asserting my rights, and watching a self-righteous tyrant discover that the real power had been in my hands all along. The lake whispered softly, the trees swayed gently, and I knew one thing for certain. The HOA had learned a lesson they would never forget. And I had my land, my calm, and the satisfaction of finally showing that rules only matter when you actually have authority. Karen might try again, maybe next week, maybe next month, but from now on, every step she took on my land would remind her, this was my world and she was merely a guest. And as I sat there, sipping my coffee, I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. Justice had been served, the lake was calm, and the neighborhood had finally seen who really owned the land and the power. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.